Okay, all yours, Melissa.
Great. You know, I'm realizing that I don't think I have this agenda available to me. I thought I brought it up, but it was the December 20th one. Is there an agenda that somebody could bring up or put in the chat?
Yes, I'll chat. I'll chat each item.
Is there a consultant on the call to take roll, or should I go
We
ahead and
we
do that?
we do have a note taker. She knows Ariel's on. She knows who's
Yep.
the staff.
Perfect.
Great.
Okay. So I guess we could start with, oh, I see. You're putting in the agenda real time. So I guess we could start with public comment then. Is anybody on the call wish to make public comment?
Let's see. Do we have Dandelion on?
Please raise your hand. Oh, yes, there we go. Heather.
There
You're
you are.
on.
Perfect.
Great. Hi, can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I gave a presentation that was similar to this for a technical meeting that DEEP held back in December. And I think there was some of the information, particularly about the financing pieces, that folks thought might be of interest for this group. So hoping to just focus mostly on those pieces, but wanted to provide some of the kind of background context too. So I'll move through most of that pretty quickly so we can get to the financing focused pieces. So overall, I'll talk a little bit about geothermal heat pumps and what they're doing for Connecticut residents and ratepayers, and then the market success conditions that we're focused on. Next slide. Go ahead. So geothermal heating and cooling with ground source heat pumps, which is the GSHP, are a whole home solution. So there are different types of ground source heat pumps, but those that we install are central systems. They are water to air, meaning that there is water moving through a closed loop of piping in the ground. And then the heat pump is taking that heat from the ground in the winter and dispersing it through central ductwork. That's the air part. To heat the home in the winter. In the summer, the system reverses and dumps heat from the home into the ground. The ground source heat pumps replacing heating fuel deliver pretty extraordinary energy savings. The TRM, the technical resource or technical reference manual for Energize Connecticut, we have 55 to 80% less energy used for heating, depending on whether you're coming off of propane, heating oil, or gas. 25% less energy used for cooling than a traditional air conditioning unit. And then you can see the associated emissions and energy bill savings. Similarly, if you're transitioning from an air source heat pump or now I'm not sure what this 75% note was, so I apologize for that. But for air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps use about half as much electricity over the course of a year. Next slide, please. So one of the other pieces that we are starting to pay more and more attention to, and really interested in how Connecticut might think about starting to incorporate into incentives for building owners, commercial and residential, who install geothermal, is the grid benefits in terms of the peak shaving relative to air source heat pumps installed in the same building. So as of today, we've installed 430 systems in Connecticut and expect to install 600 by the end of this year. And each of those systems is accomplishing between 3 and 4 kilowatts decrease in summer peak relative to traditional AC, and 3 to 6 kilowatts lower in the winter compared with the peak load that you would have from the same building being heated by a cold climate air source heat pump. And so if you add that up by the number of systems we've installed, you're looking at 2 to coming up towards 4 megawatt of generation capacity that's not needed during those peak times. And this isn't incorporated today at all into the incentives for ground source heat pumps. The Energized Connecticut rebates are based purely on the energy savings, but not on the peak. And so this is a piece that I'm interested to sort of think more with folks in Connecticut on how this might be incorporated into the way in which systems are incentivized, considering the battery and storage incentives that are available in Connecticut today. Next slide, please. This is a little bit more information about that approach to thinking about heat pumps, geothermal heat pumps for grid management purposes. The U.S. Department of Energy, didn't update this slide since December. The U.S. Department of Energy released a study in December, not last week, where they looked at if a large percentage of all buildings in the country were transitioned to ground source heat pumps rather than air source heat pumps over the course of presumed near total building electrification for the country. And they identified more than $1 trillion in savings in grid services. In other words, in distribution, transmission, and other grid services that would not need to be built because of having installed ground loops along with the heat pumps. And so there's a sort of tremendous amount in terms of both the grid infrastructure and the generation capacity that can be offset with electrifying with ground loops and ground source heat pumps. Next slide, please. And go ahead to the next slide. So in Connecticut today, the Energized Connecticut utilities provide rebates that are really critical for our customers and other customers installing ground source heat pumps. In Massachusetts and in New York, there are also significant rebates, and in some cases significantly higher now than Connecticut. And this is because Connecticut did step up to $2,000 a ton for 2023 for ground source heat pumps rebates, but then step back down starting in 2024 to $1,500 a ton because of the overall budget issue for the Energized Connecticut program. So these were our recommendations around allocating a percentage of the total heat pump rebate budget to ground source, in particular, aligned with those grid priorities from the previous couple of slides. Next slide, please. This is another piece related to the rebates, which is that because geothermal projects require multiple different types of local permits, whereas air source just require a building permit, and because of just the multiple stages of a process with drilling as well as trenching to connect piping into the home and then the heat pump installation, that the projects take a long time. And many, many projects span calendar years or rebate program years. And so we're looking for more stability and sort of upfront confirmation for a customer that their rebate will be available at the level they're expecting when they sign a contract. Next slide, please. So on to financing, of most relevance probably for this meeting. We have had incredible luck, not luck, we've had incredible success in Massachusetts because of the 0% Mass Save loan that's available there for customers. In Connecticut, we have worked the whole time we've been in the state the last few years with many of our customers accessing the maximum $15,000 amount available through the Energized Connecticut Heat Loan. But that $15,000 cap means that almost all of our customers are needing another loan to go with it. Our customers are typically financing at least $20,000, often $25,000 or more out of pocket, especially since they need to also finance for a bridge for the tax credit, the 30% uncapped federal tax credit, which can be $10,000 or $15,000. So customers often are financing, say, $35,000 or $40,000, and then 15 or 18 months later, they're getting a tax credit back, paying off a chunk of that loan, but then they still have $20,000 or $25,000 out of pocket after their tax credit. So We were thrilled this fall that the Smart E-Loan program increased the loan amounts to $50,000. That made a really big difference for us being able to recommend that all of our customers in Connecticut work with the publicly supported loan options. As I said, most of our customers do take advantage of that maximum energized Connecticut heat loan, and then they're also looking for a Smart E-Loan. We did have an issue previously, and we've been very grateful to see a transition in the program, which I'll talk about more on the next slide, that allowed us to really engage with the Smart E-Loans. So ideally, we would be looking at a Smart E-Loan 0% APR and increasing that energized Connecticut E-Loan to 50,000 rather than capped at the 15. That would definitely make a really big difference for our customers. And the other recommendation we have on the energized CT heat loans is that the special terms that have been offered in the past, so there have been times when it's been a lower special APR, that those have often had an open-ended date. So it's like special APR on offer, but without clarity of how long that rate will be available for, which I understand is for budgeting reasons. Like when you have enough customers sign up, then you shut it off. But it really creates an issue for us because it takes 4 to 6 weeks for a customer to go through our sales process typically, because they have an initial call with our sales team. We send someone out to the home to do the survey and design, and then they need to make sure they're all set with their financing. And so it takes long enough that we don't want to have them be counting on a financing product that is then no longer available when they sign their contract some number of weeks later. So if we had an end date for those special offers, that would be a big help. Next slide, please. So this was the piece around loan disbursement terms, and I'm highlighting a positive change here. We were thrilled this fall to work with folks from the Green Bank and from Nutmeg Credit Union on the change in disbursement terms, so that rather than getting a 1/3 payment on upfront and then 2/3 after the project installation, the solar industry had asked for a change, I guess, last year to change it to 3 1/3 payments out to the contractor throughout the course of the project, which, given our projects can take 6 to 15 months, it's very difficult for us to carry the cost of that financing for our customers the whole time. And so this was really helpful this fall. Staff from the Green Bank were able to work with us to change that as an available option now for ground source heat pump loans, that those disbursement terms for Smarty can be 3 1/3 payments. So that's allowed us to work much more closely with the Nutmeg State Credit Union and have more of our customers go with their Smarty loan product. We would recommend that the heat loan payment terms change in the same way to be either 2 1/2 payments or 3 1/3 payments rather than the current 100% after project install, which really does make it difficult for us as the contractor to carry the cost of that money. And we're essentially paying interest on that money on our lines of credit to do a project for a customer. And that makes it really expensive. Next slide, please. And this was the other piece that I'm really interested in, Green Bank thinking about in terms of aligning some sort of incentive that could be associated with the rebates, maybe have it somehow increase the rebate amount by acknowledging not only the total MMBTU savings with installation of these projects, but also the peak load shaving that is provided by installing a ground source heat pump. That ground loop essentially provides seasonal thermal storage in the ground. And as we all know, long duration storage is extremely valuable and will become more so in our grid of the future. And since there are energy battery storage incentives available for Connecticut customers now, what could be available in terms of a sort of, I don't know, it would need to be an innovative approach for how it is that you kind of incentivize that ground loop as a storage mechanism. So those were the things that I wanted to cover. The next slide is sort of just a summary. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot tax credits. So Connecticut does not have a state income tax credit available for homeowners who install systems. New York does, South Carolina does. We're working right now on an expansion of the tax credit in New York to make it refundable for low and moderate income families, and any tax credit in Connecticut would obviously be helpful. All right, the next slide's the final slide, I think. Thank you, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for that. I actually do have a question. Since it sounds like a lot of these projects are relying on own products to make them happen, I'm curious if you have data around what the energy savings has been versus the loan payment, and what, how much has the savings been? Is there a savings, and can you quantify it?
Yeah, so we develop really detailed proposals for customers that lay out their expected energy bill savings. For almost all of our customers, their fuel bills for heating go away, but their electric bills in the winter will increase. Their electric bills in the summer will come down if they already had traditional AC. In general, we're trying to align loan payments, which means generally terms. So if they take a 7-year mass save loan, or they take a 10 or 15 or 20-year loan, often they're doing that to align their savings with what the cost of carrying the loan will be. So that's a very common sort of set of conversations that our sales team will have with customers. I don't know how much data we have in terms of having gone back and asked customers for their energy bills after the fact of a system install. So most of what I could provide would be sort of how we do that modeling upfront on what the expected bills are.
Okay, I mean, I assume as part of our evaluation studies, we'd be going back and doing that analysis at the EEB. I don't know, Rich.
Well, I was wondering that too, because we have a big air source study going on right now. I mean, it's a heat pump study. I think it's focused on just an air source, but I don't know. Maybe somebody else knows.
Let's see what John has to say. Do you have a question that's related or not related?
Yeah, no, I don't have a question about air source. So should I continue or wait?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
My question is about what is the breakdown of the cost? Why do they cost so much? Is it labor? Is it the equipment? How does it break down?
Sure. So the interior equipment for a ground source heat pump is very similar to an air source heat pump. So the cost of the heat pump itself, the cost of installing that heat pump is very similar. So if you're looking at an air source heat pump project for the same home, the interior part of the ground source heat pump install is going to be likely very close to the same. So then the difference in cost is the exterior, the drilling equipment itself, the cost of running and maintaining that equipment, the teams who do the drilling work, and then they're installing that ground loop. The ground loop itself costs almost nothing. It's HDPE plastic. So it's the exterior system is almost all in the cost of the equipment, the heavy equipment used to do the installation, and the cost of the teams who are doing the installation, not any of the actual permanent equipment that is installed as part of the project, because again, it's plastic piping. But it's the drills and the backhoes and other equipment that's used to do the install of the piping that makes the exterior cost so significant. I mean, the way we talk about it, with customers is often that once you get that ground loop in the ground, it's expected basically to have a similar lifetime as the building, right? Like the technical reference manuals assume 50 years lifespan. DOE talks about 80 to 100 years. It's the same pipe that gas utilities put in the ground today, and we all know they rate base that for 80 years. So the plastic piping is going to be there for the life of the building, and your ground source heat pump interior to the home has a 25-year expected life. So it is longer than the 15 to 20 years for an air source heat pump. That's largely because you don't have the exterior exterior equipment. So you expect to replace the interior ground source heat pump every 25 years, but be able to keep reusing that ground loop.
And these go out like vertically from into the ground, or can they be laid out like horizontally? The pipe.
Yes, that's a good question. You can do either. Um, Our standard installation is a vertical drilled loop, usually between 300 and 600 feet deep. And we use 1.5-inch diameter piping. So one pipe down, you bend at the bottom, and another pipe up. So it's about a 5-inch diameter hole with those two pipes in it. We do that because we want to be able to install in homes that are in, pretty tight suburban, even urban lots with a driveway. We can go under a driveway and into the home. But if you do have, acreage, like an acre or more, probably a couple acres, then and you don't have trees, if you have an open field, and then you can backhoe that, and you can put a sort of slinky loop of piping down and create a horizontal, what's called a horizontal ground loop rather than a vertical ground loop. And that works very well. You just need to get it, 8 feet deep in the Northeast below frost. And it can be cheaper to install. So we have installed some of those systems for customers in more rural areas, because if you have the space, it's definitely cheaper to get that backhoe the property rather than a drill.
And I'm sorry, I just had one more question. Have you looked at all, like, can you do multi-home heat loops?
Yes, you can. So thermal energy networks or district geothermal systems are a topic of a lot of interest for a very good reason, which is that if you do have buildings that have offset heating and cooling needs, in other words, classic example is like a residential neighborhood and a data center. A data center is almost always giving off heat, and residential buildings in the Northeast need heat more of the time than they need cooling. If you have offset loads between the buildings, and the buildings aren't too far apart, then you can connect them together with a loop that will passively move that heat between the buildings, and then have some of the vertical loops or larger horizontal loops for that exchange with the ground. And those systems, whereas our systems get up to a efficiency of about 4, so 4 times a gas furnace, which can get to 95% efficiency, we can be at a COP of 4 instead of 0.95 for a gas furnace. A thermal energy loop that's well designed with offset building loads can get up to 6. So you can get extremely efficient, which is why lots of universities are installing them and moving heat between buildings. And we're involved with some of those projects, but our primary focus to date has been the single family home residential, where you're just doing one ground loop for each building. If you have a bunch of buildings that have the same load, it doesn't make sense to connect them because you have more piping and you're using power on pumping, but you're not actually getting any benefit in the offset load. So we do developments where we've got a whole bunch of townhomes in a row. We still do a ground loop for each townhome in that case.
Well, thank
Interesting. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yep, I do. This is Anthony Cozier. How you doing?
Hi.
Thank you. Good presentation. Can you explain a little bit about the Falcon curve and how geothermal systems will help the load shape in basically utilizing technology that has a higher COP as it relates to other electrification technologies? I think that supports your sort of points that you made there in terms of this demand offset. That's real, because if we continue to go through and implement electrification without doing it in a way that we can increase COP, the demand's going to be off the charts and start to actually sway the curve, if you will, in terms of what we see as our daily electrical curve.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I actually was just, I don't know if I can, but if I can share my screen, I could show a slide.
There you go.
Are you all seeing this Falcon curve
Yep.
slide? Okay, yeah. So yeah, and thank you. That's a great question. So many people have heard of the duck curve, which has to do with the production of like solar power offset from the time of day when people need to use electricity and the issues that creates. The Falcon curve is another bird curve, which was created or was put out there in the scientific literature, academic literature, by a group that included one of the women who co-founded the organization HEAT in Boston, which is a nonprofit that's been a huge proponent of thermal energy networks, particularly utility-owned thermal energy networks. And the falcon comes from the wing shape, which is indicative of, this is a seasonal chart of the electricity demand that will be required for electrification. This top curve is 100% electrification with a COP of 1, so performance of 1, coefficient of performance. So that would be if we were electrifying every building and the efficiency is like, you know, air source heat pumps that aren't cold climate highly efficient. And then you decrease and this is season, so it's showing the very high electric load that would occur during the winter, the early January, February, and November, December parts of the year. And that you can sort of decrease the shape of the wings by increasing the efficiency of the systems that you're electrifying with. And so these darker colors down here are electrifying with COPs of 4 or 6, 4 being if you did ground loops for individual buildings, and 6 being if many of those buildings were networked together on thermal energy networks. So that's the sort of, that's what the term, the falcon curve, comes from. I don't know if I explained that well. Somebody else might be able to explain it better than I just did, but.
Thanks. Anthony, did you have a follow-up or?
No, that was good. Thank you for that. I wanted you to at least share that, because that is a critical function in terms of trying to evaluate these. The only other point I'll make is that in addition to vertical and horizontal wells, the industry is pursuing diagonal-based well drilling as well, coming from the oil and gas industry. Here at Yale University, we do have actually plans in place to utilize that technology. And I think it definitely opens up the door, especially in urban areas that you don't have a lot of greenfield site, to enable accessing earth and square footage of heat exchange that you no longer were not able to access before.
Thank you, Anthony. Stephen.
Hi, so hopefully a quick question. Thanks for the presentation. Just curious, what are the actual federal tax credits? I know you mentioned nothing for Connecticut income tax, but what's the federal tax credit?
Yeah, so really wonderful outcome for geothermal from the Inflation Reduction Act. Both the commercial and individual income tax credits were really shored up in the IRA. So individual income tax credits, if you install geothermal at your home, same as if you install solar or a little wind turbine in your backyard. So it's a 30% federal individual income tax credit. It's uncapped. So if you have a $30,000 project after your Energize Connecticut rebate, then you have, 30% of that, that you're going to get that $10,000 back from the feds, but it is not refundable. So you have to owe at least $10,000 in federal taxes to be able to take advantage of that. Many people do not owe that much in federal taxes. You can roll it over for up to 5 years. So you could take $2,000 a year of federal tax credit for 5 years. But again, you've got to be able to spread that out. So that's the individual. The commercial tax credit is even better. And it is now available not just for for-profit entities that owe taxes, but also nonprofits, municipalities. Any non-tax-paying entity can get a refundable federal tax credit. And those commercial building tax credits are 30% as a base, as long as you're either under a size limit or using prevailing wage and apprentice labor. 30% and then up to 40% if you meet domestic content, so made in the USA, which our ground source heat pumps are made in the United States, and then up to 50% if you're located in an energy community and made in the USA. And that 30, 40, or 50% again can be paid back to you as a check from the feds if you are a non-tax-paying entity like the school district. So there are many school districts that are starting to look at geothermal now because it's actually lowest first cost, cheaper than putting in gas furnaces in a new school today now because of that tax credit.
Thank you. That's perfect. Thanks.
I'm glad you asked that question, Steve. That was great information. Anybody else, kind of have to move on to the rest, but I thank you for your presentation, Heather.
I have one quick question.
Oh.
Does anybody put these in themselves?
That's a good question. We've had customers who do have acreage who, you know, either have their own equipment or want to work with someone local to put in a horizontal loop, like with a backhoe, and asked us to just do the heat pump. And we don't do that as a company, but I do know that there are ground source heat pump installers who will do that. The equipment for the drilling is, we use sort of a compact tracked rig that we bought a bunch of them from Italy. Actually, they came over on ships like once a month last year, so that we can get into small lots. But if you have more space, the same equipment you use for water well drilling, the big water well rigs, can be used for geothermal too. And a lot of the drill rigs that are used in more rural areas are the same companies that do water wells. And so sometimes you get like a partnership and somebody will be able to do a combination that way too.
Thank you.
Okay, last call. Okay, thank you so much, Heather. Next on the agenda is, oh, I'm sorry, was there someone else? No. Okay, next on the agenda is review and approval of minutes from June and December. Do we do this separately? I don't know how we get people to approve the December meeting minutes if we didn't have a quorum at the December meeting. That's a process question. Or does it have to be a quorum of the people who attended?
So right now we have 3 of 5, so we have a quorum. The December meeting didn't have a quorum, but we took minutes. I don't know, Brian, if you want to opine, but so we're just going back to approving June and December meetings with
So
the
you have
current
3
Yeah.
of 5 members, you should be good.
Yeah, I'll approve the June ones, but I have to abstain from the December ones since I didn't attend.
Yeah, an abstention effectively works as a no, so I would just get it approved at the next meeting then.
Well, but, okay,
It depends. I would suggest that if there are 2 others on the joint committee who want to approve it, we would have both meetings approved and one no.
I also believe I was not at those meetings.
There we go. All right. So there would be 2 abstentions. There.
oh, wow, Kathy's on. Kathy has a question.
Why not do an e-vote?
Uh,
That way the people who were there would be able to vote.
You cannot do that. The voting can only occur through through this public meeting.
Okay, thank you.
but
I mean,
no,
if there wasn't a quorum last meeting, it doesn't sound like you'd have a quorum to approve minutes anyway.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't realize.
Well, if there was no quorum at the last meeting, there's no minutes to approve either way.
so there'd
Okay,
be
well, I move to approve the June meeting minutes.
Second, John Harity.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any abstentions?
Abstention, because I wasn't there.
Okay, so what's our tally here?
2-1.
Oh, does that work?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay, yay, meeting minutes.
and then just on the other one, so I guess, Brian, we could either leave the meetings as draft and never approve them, just to make them publicly available, but I don't think we'd want to throw them away.
If there was no quorum, then there was no public meeting, so I wouldn't vote on them. You can leave them draft for the transparency of the public to be able to see them. That's what I would suggest doing.
Okay.
I agree with you.
Okay. All right, so moving on to clean energy jobs report.
All right. Thank you for that, Melissa. That was different. I like that. All right. So let me introduce Lori Baca. Lori, it's great to meet you. let me just provide some context. For the last couple of years, our EDC colleagues in the Green Bank, through our respective, administration of the system benefit funds, have been jointly supporting the Clean Energy Jobs Report. I think this is our fourth report. And these are the draft findings from BW Research, and Lori will be presenting them. I've got the slides, Lori, so I'll pull them up. Just go ahead and tell me when to move forward. But Lori, welcome.
Terrific. Thank you so much for having me here. So I'm Lori Baca. I'm a project manager at BW Research that helped to develop this fourth version of the Clean Energy Report. And then in this presentation, I'll just briefly go over the objectives and methodology that were underlying this Clean Energy Industry Report, which is consistent with last year's report, and then just briefly summarize some of the key findings from this year's report. And this presentation is intended to be very brief. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in learning more or obtaining more data about any of these findings to please check out the full version of the CEIR when it's released to the public. Next slide, please. So just going through the report overview, the purpose of the report is just to measure, characterize, and analyze clean energy and traditional energy employment trends across different technology sectors and looking at the impact of clean energy jobs on the state's economy. Next slide, please. And as far as methodology goes, as in the past, the study is based on data from the USER, which is the U.S. Energy and Employment Report that is prepared on an annual basis for the DOE, which takes data from the BLS through like the third or the fourth quarter of 2022. And we supplement it with data from surveys that have been designed and administered by BW Research over the first quarter of 2023. And we use those data together to get a picture of employment for clean energy and energy jobs in the different states. So for Connecticut, what this came out to was 618 business establishments were surveyed, which yielded a margin of error about plus or minus 4%, give or take, based on a 95% confidence interval. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of key findings, the key takeaways from this year's report, we see that Connecticut has continued to be a leader in the nation's efforts to support clean energy, with the state continuing to rank in the top 10 most energy efficient states as measured by the ACEEE Energy Efficiency Scorecard. And then we also saw that the state made strong commitments to advancing clean energy through various policy commitments over the last couple of years, including initiatives to strengthen the state's building energy codes and to implement a zero emission vehicle program. Also, the governor's energy action plan has set out a goal of achieving zero carbon electricity economy by 2040. And the state has made significant progress toward achieving this goal through various investments in renewable energy technologies like fuel cells, offshore wind. And with respect to offshore wind, in 2022, the state had the highest concentration of offshore wind supply chain jobs in the nation and had made a significant commitment to 2,000 megawatts of offshore wind capacity, which is enough to power 1 million homes. So in terms of our findings from the report for clean energy jobs, in the following slides, we'll see that clean energy employment in the state has recovered from pandemic-induced losses. As you look at the data, you'll see that employment was going really well for a while, and then you'll see this drastic fall in 2020 due to the pandemic, and then things start to improve. So in 2022, you'll see this recovery both in terms of the number of jobs and in terms of the number of hours spent by clean energy workers on clean energy activities in 2022. Another key finding that we had was just after conducting an employer survey, we found that there were high levels of hiring difficulties for clean energy workers in the state, but they were comparable to levels of difficulty reported nationally. So this is not exclusive to Connecticut by any means. But that these hiring difficulties for clean energy workers could limit the future growth potential of the clean energy economy, absent additional investments in workforce development for clean energy workers. And then the last point that we wanted to make as far as key findings were concerned was that we saw, looking at growth by value chain sector, that there was growth in manufacturing and other value chain sectors that outpaced growth in the construction sector, and that growth in the GSP outpaced growth in the clean energy employment. So what we were seeing was that the state's efforts in fostering innovation and supporting manufacturing and services in clean energy are paying off, and they should be sustained, but that the state could perhaps consider some additional incentives and maybe like solar or energy efficiency to help bolster deployment. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, this next slide shows the clean energy jobs rising steadily from 2015 to 2019, reaching about 44,000 clean energy jobs in 2019. And then you see that big drop right when the pandemic hit, with jobs falling by like 3,000 jobs due to COVID. And then you'll see employment starting to rebound in 2021. And over the last year in 2022, you'll see an almost 3% increase in net clean energy jobs year over year, yielding a total of about 44K clean energy jobs in Connecticut at the end of 2022, which accounted for about a little over 2% of all jobs in the state. Next slide, please. So this slide is kind of similar, but it shows growth in clean energy activities through a slightly different lens, which is adjusted for employment intensity. So what the previous slide shows was just the total number of clean energy workers, and that doesn't tell us anything about how much time a clean energy worker might be spending on clean energy activities. So you might have a clean energy job as a worker that's spending maybe like 10% of their time doing clean energy. But what this slide looks at is we asked the clean energy workers, how much of your time are you spending on clean energy activities? And then we converted this to full-time equivalents. So this slide shows changes in FTE clean energy jobs over the same period. So you'll see the similar trend of jobs really growing quickly from 2015 through 2019, and then that big drop in 2020 due to COVID, and then things starting to pick up again in 2021, and ending the year in 2022 with about 31,000 clean energy FTE jobs, which is pretty similar to what you see in 2019, which is about 31K as well, and higher than the pre-COVID levels in 2015 through 2018. So I guess the key takeaway from the two slides together is that we're seeing not only the clean energy jobs increasing over that period, but we're also seeing the actual number of hours spent on clean energy activities having grown in 2022. Next slide, please. So this next slide just shows the contribution to gross regional product that these clean energy jobs have provided over the last several years. And we can see that in 2022, clean energy activities accounted for about $7.68 billion of GRP, which represents an 8.5% increase over the previous year. And that clean energy activities accounted for about 3% of the state's total GRP in 2022. Next slide, please. So this next slide explores the clean energy GRP by value chain over the last year. And then if you look at it, you can see that all of the value chain segments other than construction saw GRP growth between 2021 and 2022, with construction losing about almost 10% of GRP, but then this other services value chain segment having this huge rate of growth of over 100%, almost 129%. With that other services value chain segment accounting for things like vehicle maintenance for hybrid and electric vehicles, things like that, as well as workers and nonprofits that deal with conservation, things like that are captured in that value chain segment. Next slide, please. And then, okay, so turning back to employment, this next slide just gives you a quick benchmark of Connecticut's 2022 clean energy job growth compared to both like the overall state economy, where you can see the growth was 1.7%, whereas the clean energy employment growth was 2.9%, so considerably higher. And then in relation to other states, it was kind of in the middle of the pack, being much higher than Vermont. Roughly similar to Rhode Island and considerably lower than Massachusetts and the national average. Next slide, please. So let's see. Okay, this next slide talks about clean energy employment by technology. And then here, considering there are like about 4,500 clean energy establishments in Connecticut, mostly concentrated in this energy efficiency sector, you'll see that there wasn't that much difference in the performance of the energy efficiency sector over the last year. More of the growth was concentrated in clean energy generation, alternative transportation, and this clean grid and storage sectors. With the largest growth in percentage terms occurring in the alternative transportation sector, which grew by 17% year over year, adding 429 jobs. And then jobs in that alternative transportation sector growing faster than the national average for the sector over the last year. Next slide, please. And then now exploring just that clean energy generation segment and looking at it by technology, you can see that solar continues to be the largest clean energy generation technology subsector in the state, accounting for about 3,000 jobs in 2022, which represents an almost 6% growth rate over the prior year. And then you'll see there was an increase, but not as profound of an increase in some of these other sectors like nuclear, bioenergy, et cetera, or low impact hydropower. But you did see a very large increase in jobs in percentage terms in geothermal of 82.2%. But just to note that it was from a very small base. So it was only like an addition of 40 jobs, since geothermal represents a very small percentage of these total jobs in clean energy generation by technology. Okay, next slide, please. And then so this next slide presents employment growth by value chain. So you can see here that most of these clean energy value chain segments grew in 2022, with only the utility segment losing about 6% of jobs, and which is about 62 jobs in 2022, which we think might be due to the closure of this Hartford trash incinerator plant. And then in terms of which value chain segment had the highest rate of growth over the last year, that was that other services value chain segment, which added 348 jobs, growing by about 11%. And then the manufacturing and the wholesale trade value chain sectors having small but positive growth of almost 6 to 7% in 2022. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide just looks at the worker demographics in the state's clean energy economy and then compares it to the overall state workforce, as well as the US clean energy averages, and then the overall US workforce. So you'll see here, women are considerably less represented in Connecticut's clean energy industry as compared to the state overall, and the US overall accounting for about 1 in 4 clean energy workers as compared to 1 in 2 overall for the state and for the nation, but roughly comparable to the US clean energy workforce, which is Not too surprising, given that a lot of these clean energy jobs are concentrated in the construction industry where women have been very historically underrepresented. So this just kind of reflects the composition of the clean energy workforce. In terms of age, you'll see something similar for 55 and over workers, that there's these types of workers are somewhat underrepresented compared to the state overall and the nation overall, but that the representation is somewhat similar to the US clean energy average. And the same sort of pattern for minorities and veterans, except that the veterans have a slightly higher share in the Connecticut clean energy workforce compared to the overall state and the overall US, but relatively similar pattern to that US clean energy workforce. And then the demographics from 2022 were not too different from the prior year. It looked like maybe things became a little bit more diverse, but not really significantly. So it shows that there's been a lot of progress in increasing the diversity of the clean energy workforce, but there's still some work that could be done to just increase the representation of some of these groups in the clean energy economy. Next slide, please. Okay, so this next slide talks about the results of that employer survey that we conducted, where we asked clean energy employers whether or not they found it difficult to hire clean energy workers over the last year. And then you see that almost all of these clean energy employers found it difficult to hire clean energy workers in 2022, with like 90.5%, indicating that it was either very difficult or somewhat difficult to hire clean energy workers. Now this number is pretty high, but it's very similar to the national average. So not necessarily a cause for alarm specific to the state. And the other thing that you'll notice is, looking at 2021 and 2022, the numbers reporting difficulties, or the share reporting difficulties, is pretty constant from 90.4% to 90.5%. But the one thing that you will see is that the proportion of employers that said that hiring was very difficult actually decreased a little bit over the last year. So even though the total stayed the same, at least, you know, it became somewhat difficult instead of very difficult for some of these clean energy employers. And let's see, based on the survey, what else did we find? About 52% said that competition was the main reason for hiring difficulties, and the two most difficult positions to fill were technicians and mechanical support positions. And I think that was my last slide. So yeah, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present some of the key findings from our clean energy industry report. And as mentioned previously, like, if you want any additional information, I would invite everyone to check out the full version of the report when it becomes available.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Lori?
Yeah, I had one
Yes,
question.
John.
I wondered if there'd been thought given, I mean, you just report on what's happening and not necessarily shaping policy, but it seems to me that a group that might be losing jobs would be auto technicians, and that it might be good to begin designing recruitment in that group for energy workers.
Yes, that's a great point. Thank you very much.
Ron.
Yes,
Go,
yeah, thank you. That was a great presentation. The question I have is, you know, the previous slide talked about the difficulty in hiring, and I guess is that unique to the, you know, the clean energy sector, or is this indicative of other sectors as a whole?
It's difficult for me to speak to the other sectors, but this is definitely a pattern that we've seen in states all over the region. We've been preparing these clean energy industry reports for like Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maine, like all of these different states, and across the board. And I guess even nationwide, you'll see these clean energy hiring difficulties, with a lot of the states saying, in addition to technicians and mechanical support, also having a hard time finding things like electricians. So I think it's really a nationwide shortage that's coming into play, particularly as more states invest in this transition to like a zero carbon economy. There's a lot more competition for the available workforce.
Thank you.
Brian.
Maybe two comments. One is just in terms of the United States Energy Employment Report, the USER report, the methodology that this is all based on, just to kind of orient the Joint Committee and our respective teams. We went through an exercise about 5 years ago where we took the different industries that the USER report looks at, and then we took Connecticut policy on clean energy and focused this report only on the clean energy areas that we wanted to focus on in Connecticut. So there is policy alignment, but it's about 5 years old. So we may flag it as something to kind of look at in the future to see if we need to recalibrate. The second thing is that this is backward. This is not forward looking, it's backwards, right? It's looking back. So a couple things there. One is I think 2023 was a banner year for clean energy, I think. But if we were to look at, say, all the public policy targets that we have for 2030, our GHG reduction targets are 80% weatherization of homes by 2030, our 45% renewable target by our battery storage target, and look at forward looking what the job should be. I think what we're going to see is that our labor is going to be short. And that just my gut. I'm not a labor expert, but that it's going to require more lift in terms of the workforce to get to the demand to hit those targets. So just something to think about. I'm not, just something to put out there, for folks to be thinking about.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you so much. Oh, I apologize.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the case as well, but I also think that we've countered this before where we build up workforce, but then there's not the funding to do the work. So for me, it's the funding comes first and then the workforce. So we have to be eyeing both of those things.
I second that.
Lori, do you look at like ACEEE information at all? Are they using like the similar databases as you? Because I know they've done a workforce study to say like, well, if Connecticut wanted to meet its 80% weatherization goal, then it would need to increase the workforce by this amount. Is that something that you're aware of or you've been looking at it all?
We haven't really incorporated that into our clean energy industry reports. We look more at like the primary data from the BLS or from survey data that we've collected. But we do reference it as like secondary research when describing the policy environment, but we don't rely on the directly rely on the research that was provided by ACEEE in our report.
Thanks. Yeah. All right. Does anyone have any final questions before we move on? Seeing none, move on to our plan coordination. Thank you.
Give me 1 second. My system's slow. All right. We're going to transition here. All right. So why don't I tee it off in terms of the comprehensive plan process in terms of where we are with the Connecticut Green Bank. So just at a high level, in terms of the program areas that we're focused on currently, we have 3 programmatic areas. Our incentive programs really evolve around implementing Public Act 21-53 with our utility colleagues co-administering the Energy Storage Solutions Program. There's a 580 megawatt by the end of 2030 regulatory target, 290 megawatts for residential, 290 megawatts for non-residential. In terms of where we are, we've got a long ways to go when it comes to residential. We have over 400 projects totaling more than 3 megawatts of residential projects. So our challenge there on the residential side is demand creation. Customers have yet to realize the value, or we are challenged with determining what the value proposition is for customers. Resilience right now isn't enough, or maybe we've benefited from having a reliable grid in the last couple of years that's not causing people to demand, storage alongside solar. So a lot of work to be done on the residential side. On the non-residential side, we've got 37 projects totaling over 80 megawatts. The challenge there is that these are really large projects, so they have to work themselves through the interconnection queues. So it's going to require a lot of planning and looking at nodes and so forth to before the utilities approve of those projects moving forward. So the incentive programs focusing a lot around storage. On the financing programs, we've got our commercial property assessed clean energy program that's chugging away. We are working on right now through a public comment process, including resilience as a component of CPACE. Our board just had a robust conversation last week on it after public comment through the Connecticut Law Journal. So stay tuned for that. The ability for people to use CPACE as a mechanism to finance resilience. We're going to hear from our team on our utility colleagues and our Green Bank team on the Small Business Energy Advantage. We continue to implement our solar power purchase agreement program inclusive of storage as we look ahead to combine energy storage solutions with solar, that reduces energy costs. How do we increase energy security? And then one of our programs that is a technical assistance all the way to financial assistance is our Marketplace Assistance Program. And we are currently launching the affordable housing aspect of that program to support Public Act 21-48. So super excited by that market now being open for business. And then our third programmatic area, environmental infrastructure, as a result of Public Act 21-115, our scope expanded to include environmental infrastructure. So what we're working on right now is getting our flagship financing products with our local community banks and credit unions through Smarty to be inclusive of measures beyond clean energy. We're working on climate adaptation and resilience and water measures. So building those out, working with contractors to be able to deliver those measures to customers who want, to improve their homes with those types of measures, and then CPACE, as I noted above. So that's where we're heavy in terms of our current program implementation. We are digging into, we're going to talk a little bit later about the Inflation Reduction Act and specifically the investment tax credits. As Heather noted, they're really exciting, lots of opportunities there. But also one of the programs there that we're awaiting EPA announcements on is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the $27 billion. There's $7 billion there for Solar for All. There will be up to 60 winners. DEEP submitted an outstanding application for our, I think what we called it, Hank, Project Sunbridge, which is really leaning into deploying solar storage, enabling upgrades, roof replacements, health and safety, things that are associated with solar to reduce energy burden, with the target on the affordable housing sector, which has totally been left behind in Connecticut's market, but now we think is ready for business with all of the agencies having worked super hard with PURA to get all the regs in place. So we're awaiting that. I think EPA has stated likely in April they will make those announcements for Solar for All. And then we're waiting any day now for the EPA announcement. We feel optimistic that Connecticut will be a part of several winning applications underneath the National Clean Investment Fund, which is the $14 billion that will be awarded to 2 to 3 nonprofit administrators. And then the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, which is a $6 billion pool of funding that will award 3 to 7 nonprofit administrators to provide up to $10 million of startup financing for community lenders such as green banks. But our priorities in terms of what we're hoping for, if it comes through for Connecticut, having been a part of one of the applications, first is green infrastructure per that environmental infrastructure that I noted above. Governor Lamont led that effort. There's an environmental infrastructure fund that wasn't funded, but we are anticipating and competed specifically for resources to capitalize that environmental infrastructure fund to allow us to do environmental infrastructure projects to finance them. Green school buses is a component of that activity to support the 2030 target of 100% zero emission school buses in environmental justice communities. So working with our colleagues at DEEP, PURA, and elsewhere, our communities to get to that. Green resilience hubs is a big activity. Green school buildings, green municipal and the commercial building, yada, yada. You can kind of see the items here. But fingers crossed, hopefully next week we will learn about not only the winning applications, but also the amounts for those winners. And hopefully we are among them. We're optimistic. We think that we are, but we will stay tuned for the EPA announcement. And once they announce, then that will form the basis for how we then think about the next fiscal year. Our planning cycle is May. We meet with our Budget Operations and Compensation Committee, which John here on this committee chairs. They deal with a number of different things on the revenue side, on the expense side, on the program target side, on the investment side, and then make a recommendation to the board in June for the fiscal year 25, which starts in July. So that's our cycle. And yeah, happy to take any questions, comments.
I have some comments. So in terms of the residential sector and trying to deploy more battery storage, I know that, you know, obviously customers can get a demand response credit on their utility bills for having it, but I'm guessing it's nowhere near as lucrative to make it worth spending the money on the batteries. Or if you incorporate the incentives, I wonder what the difference is there. But then I'm also wondering, is there any opportunity to align the demand response incentive with the investment in a way to make sure that those who have less resources to spend on the batteries get more of a demand response incentive? Does that make sense?
It does. Hold that comment, Melissa. We have another section here where we're going to like dive into each solar, heat pumps, and then storage, where we'll go into those different pieces. Yeah.
And then I just had another question. I think that you were mentioning Public Act 2148, right? Didn't we take that money for the energy efficiency funds? There was a $7 million in ARPA that it was like funded with, but I feel like we took that.
No, well, maybe, but there was a section 2 that had to deal with the Residential Renewable Energy Solutions Program and giving PURA the discretion, working with the Department of Housing, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, DEEP, and the Green Bank to determine what affordable housing is. So that was like a 2-year process, and that definition is now out in the market, along with the associated incentives, which we'll talk about. They're really good, but they're outside of any of our system benefit funds.
Okay, thanks. Kathy.
Sorry about the camera business. Just clarification question with the announcement that's going to be made next week. Is that several applications, or is that all wrapped into one application? All the items that you were listing.
Gotcha. So the items that are listed here are included in both. applications. There are 2 different applications. We're anticipating 2 different winners in each of the different programs. So we think fingers crossed, we think we picked the right nonprofit applicants that will be among the winners announced. We just have to wait for the announcement.
Gotcha. So we could be winning up to 4? Is that what we're talking? 2 in each?
No. So how do I say this? Yeah, no, they're super complicated, and they were designed. The EPA designed them that way. There will be 2 to 3 underneath the NCIF and there's likely going to be 3, we think, winners of the NCIF, $14 billion. So those will go into nonprofit organizations that will then loan that money out, because this is financing. They want to get this low-cost capital out to low-income and disadvantaged communities. We are a subawardee in each of these 2 different proposals. So we think we've picked the applicants with the best proposals.
Gotcha. Well, fingers crossed that it all works out. Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy.
All right, do we want to move on to CNLM?
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Stacy Sherwood, lead technical consultant on behalf of the EEB. And just recognizing time and how many more slides we have to go, I'll kind of keep this a little bit more brief than I had intended. My goal is to catch you up on what we've been doing since the last joint Green Bank meeting in December, and then what we're going to be doing going forward for the next 3-year plan. And since we recognize that some people were not on the last call, I'll go back a little bit, 2 more bullet points ahead on this timeline and say in November 2023, the companies filed their 2024 plan update. As part of that, they requested updated budgets and projections for their savings. And in December 2023, DEEP issued that interim determination on the budget for the companies to continue going forward. Over budget by approximately $22 million on the residential side. And so we were trying to figure out how to balance that within the 3-year plan, which runs 2022 through 2024. Fortunately, in January of 2024, PURA allocated Park City Wind funds to the electric CNLM programs, and the Park City Wind funds were in the amount of $16 million, and that was the result of a termination fee associated with power purchase agreements from an offshore wind project that was deemed to be no longer financially viable. So knowing that we had these additional funds that were split between UI and Eversource Electric, the EEB and the companies held several discussions as part of meetings in January and February to talk about different budget scenarios to address the shortfall that occurred due to overspending in 2023. Based on those discussions, we were able to come to an agreement, and the EEB issued an e-vote approving the 2024 budget update in March of this year. So if you go to the next slide, this provides a summary of the savings and benefits that are resulting for 2024. The projection is provided in the second to last row in that table. We have about 126 gigawatt hours of electric savings, 126 megawatts of peak demand reduction, and 395 in gas savings here. I had some facts here that kind of contradict the updated report, but essentially the 3-year plan was supporting 34,000 jobs in Connecticut annually and generates $2.33 for every dollar that's invested into the CNLM programs. On the next slide. So we're currently developing the schedule for the 3-year plan development, and that's going to be released in April. I do have a brief one on the next slide I'll go over in a second of the general outline for it. We are currently holding several public input sessions that will happen between spring and summer, leading up to the board's vote on the 2025 through 2027 plan. The most current public input session that we will be holding is regarding the themes and priorities for the next 3-year plan. And we're going to be hosting 2 public input sessions, one on Tuesday, March 26th from 5:30 to 6:30 and one on Wednesday, April 3rd from 12 to 1 p.m. If you click on the slides, it's embedded in there so you can follow the meeting links if you're interested in participating. On the next slide, I have what are some of the potential priorities that we're considering. And as I said, I'm going to keep this high level, but expanding the DEI efforts that the board has currently implemented as part of the CNLM programs, perhaps developing decarbonization goals. We currently don't have greenhouse gas emission goals, but maybe making that part of performance management incentives for the companies. Addressing building electrification readiness. So recognizing that maybe not everybody's ready to fully electrify, but making sure we prepare those buildings for that through weatherization. And also expanding electrification efforts. We've had a lot of concentration over this last 3-year plan on space heating, but we should be expanding into heat pump water heaters and electric cooking as well. And something we're probably going to talk about in a little bit is bundling energy efficiency with distributed energy resources. So finding ways to bundle solar and batteries with heat pumps to reduce those electric costs and energy burdens. And finally, talking about leveraging federal policies and local energy policies to further the dollars that the CNLM programs have to invest in energy efficiency. On the last slide here, this is that general outline timeline that I was speaking of. So we have planning going on in March and April. This is where we're developing the priorities, program modifications, budgets, and evaluation study findings that we'll receive from the evaluation administrators. Then we'll have public input sessions, as I mentioned, throughout the spring and into the summer, and the companies will provide first drafts in May through July, and this includes the draft budgets, the text, the savings, and the program savings document. Additional drafts will be provided throughout the months of July through September, and the board will be voting on the final drafts to send for deep approval in both September and October, with the final plan being filed on November 1. I know I went very quickly, but I know that the next subject is extremely important. Are there any questions on this? All right, we'll have more updates, I think, at the next joint green bank. So thank you.
Thanks. Don't see any questions on that. So the next segment is the legislative session.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Brian Farnan. I'm the General Counsel for the Connecticut Green Bank. We'll go through some of the major bills, and also just as a heads up, as of last Friday, I think 23 of the legislative committees have completed their public hearing portion of their work. And that would include the environmental and the E&T committees, the ones that we'd be most concerned about. Big legislation as of today, actually the Green Monster Bill got out of committee by a party vote. That is that omnibus legislative bill. It has 22 sections. DEEP is going to develop under this a nature-based solution plan. It establishes a Connecticut clean energy economy. It has an expansion for battery storage. It's something like 1,000 megawatts. And then I think most important to this group is that there is a DEEP Pure Green Bank initiative included within that to develop and implement a plan for heat pump development, something like 310,000 by 2030. Other legislation, 5439, this also sets a deployment heat target for heat pumps. 5438, this is a bill that appropriates $145 million to DEEP from the general fund, and identifies, obviously, energy efficiency programs in the conservation and load management program. Other bills that you'd probably want to be made aware of. There is SB 11, the governor's resiliency legislation. This includes things like resiliency improvement districts, which incorporate a definition for like increased savings, and other items out there is there's a DEEP agency bill that deals with any generator of 26 tons per year of organic materials has to put in place a written policy for food donation. And I think the general kind of thought out there is that and these aren't my opinions, but I think the general feeling out there is that last legislative session, there weren't those kind of marquee energy bills. So I think the legislature and the governor's office really have, a strong consensus. They want something big's going to get done this year. So that's the update, and I'm happy to take any questions. Hey, Ron.
Yep. Hey, Brian, quick question. Any update on House Bill 5052? That's an extremely important bill for municipalities in the CNI programs. So I was just, because it basically has to do with how funding or rebates are treated, and they're not treated favorably right now in the municipal sector.
So that's House Bill 5052?
Yes.
I don't. I could definitely look into it though and get back to you. Wait, is this there's the
That's the
school
governor's-
bill? Are you talking about
the
that
governor's
one?
bill,
No,
right?
this is the one that has to do with how grants are going to municipalities are treated. And presently, if a municipality gets a utility rebate, that gets subtracted out of their grant and grant calculation, and so they actually lose money. So it disincentivizes them to do a lot of the energy efficiency upgrades. And it certainly hurts us on both new construction as well as on retrofit basis.
Yeah, Brian, that's section
Um,
1 of the governor's bill.
Oh, go ahead, Mackie.
That's section 1 of the governor's bill.
We'll
okay.
address that disincentive, correct?
Correct.
Thanks,
I don't know
Mackie.
the current status of that bill, but that.
And then
Yeah.
question by Richard.
Yeah, thanks for this. This is helpful. So the two bills about related to 310,000 heat pumps, you mentioned neither plan has a funding source. Any sense of where that money might come from? Or I just want to be prepared if somebody's planning to take it from the Energy Efficiency Board funding.
I don't think so. I would hope not. I know there's kind of analogy being made to the success that occurred in Maine, where they used a small portion of funding, which then turned into an exponential amount of heat pump deployment. So I think I think that's part of their hope. I mean, and obviously, legislators not only in Connecticut but across the country are it's much easier to set a target and then have all the tools to achieve that target.
Also,
I
I
mean-
think that at least in the climate bill, it's they need to develop a plan. So maybe there's the development of the plan and then like identifying how much funding is needed in order to get it, maybe.
I think that that will be a likely step in that process.
Just related to this topic, although it is a competitive grant that we are competing for. So, but we are Connecticut is the lead state of a multi-state application that's going to go in for the climate pollution reduction grants through EPA and trying to get a significant amount of funding to accelerate heat pump deployment throughout the region. But again, that's a very competitive program. Our region has advantages and disadvantages in competing with other parts of the country. So we shouldn't be counting on it, but hopefully all of these things fall into place at the same time. But certainly the setting of the target is, I think, the first step in instigating some of that. So.
Yeah, thanks, Hank. I think it is exciting times because there's a lot of X factor out there with what's going to happen with potential federal dollars coming into Connecticut and other states that are going to hopefully increase deployment. Obviously, you do have concerns like we talked about earlier in this meeting about workforce development and other things to achieve those goals. So, but those are better arguments to have about, oh man, how are we going to find the workers to do that? Those are arguments I'd rather be concerned about that than some of the concerns we've had in the past.
Do you know what changed in 5004 in the substitute?
I do not. James DeSantis, who's our legislative liaison, was up there all day. I was actually going to have him do this report out, but he wanted to really stay up in Hartford. He would have that new bill
Yeah, I'm
language.
looking through it now. I don't see anything different. Curious. Okay. All right. Is that done with legislative updates?
That's all I got.
Okay. I mean, one thing to note, and I think the utilities commented us on this as well, the way the current $145 million is written, it's for one calendar year, which would not be good for us. We wouldn't be able to deploy $145 million this calendar year. So that's worth noting. If anybody else is talking to any legislators about how to deploy that money, if it were to be appropriated, it should be over multiple years. Okay. Should we move on to healthy housing? Who's presenting this one?
All right. So why don't I tee this up? So we had a couple of things. One is Brenda has wanted to for us to be thinking about on every quarterly agenda healthy housing. For every agenda for the past couple of years, we've had pretty robust conversations on a lot of different things, from SCEF to the affordable housing program I noted earlier to this that we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to invite my colleagues from the EDCs, the EEB consultants, and then Mackie, feel free to as well to jump in. This is why we wanted the December 20 meeting minutes not to be lost. But at the last meeting, at the suggestion of the EEB consultants, they asked the EDCs and the Green Bank to, sit down, assess solar PV and heat pumps, that kind of interconnection, and to begin to think about more. So we talked about storage, but we should be thinking about more, right? We heard earlier from ground source heat pumps. We should be thinking about EVs. There's probably a whole list of other things, but we're going to show you some of the things we've been working on for the last couple of months, specifically in the residential market segment. So we got together on January 26th to really dig into state and federal incentives for solar heat pumps and storage. And then we met again to discuss the findings from that meeting, and we're going to try to lay out some questions for considerations and some possible next steps, and are looking for some guidance here. I think we're going to lose you, John, but feel free. We can touch base following this.
And actually, my other meeting got canceled.
All right, good. All right, perfect. Cool. All right, so we're going to share with you some of the statistics that we talked about and collected that are really trying to get at, the economics of these technologies. So the first is solar PV, which is really built around the public policy for the Residential Renewable Energy Solutions Program, which is administered by Eversource NUI. So there are state incentives in the form of tariffs. You can get a per kilowatt hour rate for 20 years, or you could get your net metered through a monthly netting rate for 20 years, and possibly adders as it applies to the renewable energy credits. But the market applies to single family. And then, as I was talking about there, Melissa, with Public Act 2148, Section 2, now we've got affordable housing. So there's a whole set of tiers. I think there's somewhat, Mackie, 1,300 properties, maybe 85,000 units of affordable housing that now have access to this incentive program, which is pretty substantial. So if you look at it, the tariff, would pay about 31.9 cents per kilowatt hour from that solar PV system over a 20-year period, in addition to adders. So one of the things that Pura has built in across its equitable modern grid framework is the importance of equity and access to the benefits of these technologies. So if you are a project that's located in a distressed community, we all know that definition, the DECD definition, then you can receive an additional 2.75 cents per kilowatt hour. Or if you're determined to be low income, you can receive 5.5 cents more per kilowatt hour. Low income households are deemed affordable housing. If you just add 31.89 plus 5.5, you're talking about almost 37 cents per kilowatt hour for the buy-all tariff for affordable housing. And then there's a monthly netting tariff that operates a lot like net metering, and it also has some of its adders. Currently, about 95% at least of the market operates off of monthly netting. The buy-all tariff specifically will be good for and is only available for affordable housing. There are federal incentives. The Inflation Reduction Act has all those tax credits that Heather was talking about. You've got the 30% investment tax credit, and then there are adders for third-party owned systems. 10% for those projects located in energy communities, for example, Bridgeport. Energy communities has a specific definition. Happy to go into that. 10 to 20% more for projects in low-income communities. And then there is the domestic content provision, but for solar, it's unlikely until the domestic supply chain and hardware manufacturing happens in this country, which is starting to be built out, but there's also a possible 10% there. So the ITC can be between 30 to 60% for solar PV plus storage. And then, as I was talking about, under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, that will have federal requirements, including prevailing wage and Davis-Bacon, the Build America, Buy America provisions, and then some of the two programs that I was talking about earlier, Solar for All, a deep lead application would provide resources to allow us to do a lot of different things with financing, lower interest rates, plug into different capital structures, a lot of ways to innovatively finance these technologies. But again, our focus is on the affordable housing market segment, which has really been left behind. The overall Connecticut residential market is doing really well. So that's why in the 2033 data is going to look really good, because I think the state deployed about 120 megawatts of residential solar, which is about $400 to $500 million of investment. So that market's certainly taking off, and we want to make sure that low-income families have access to the benefits, and that's going to be the foundation of our Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund efforts. And then the National Clean Investment Fund, as I was talking about on the green homes. But overall, we tried to include some other statistics. The average installed cost, $3,500 per kilowatt. Levelized cost of energy. This might be an interesting one to try to do to understand ground source heat pumps. But after the ITC, the 30% ITC, no financing, including no interest, the levelized cost of energy for solar in Connecticut at $3,500 per kilowatt is about 11 cents. And we know that we're paying 25 to 30 cents per kilowatt hour. So there's a big delta. That's why the market's taking off. One of the many reasons. So that's the solar. We just wanted to put all that information down because we want to now think about how we can pair these technologies together with things like heat pumps. So we talked through the CL&M programs that are coming, our state incentives. So we've got the air source heat pumps per ton and the ground source heat pumps per ton with various project caps on those rebates, depending on the type of customer that we're talking about. So we were really digging into the HES income eligible customers, wanting to make sure that those customers have access to the benefits of these technologies. Then we started to lay out some of the federal incentives underneath the IIJA, some resources that are coming to Connecticut, as well as the IRA, the tax credits, up to 30%, the lesser of up to 30% of installed cost, or $1,200 to $2,000, including heat pumps for energy efficiency. So that's all money on the table. This is one of my favorite tax credits to talk about underneath the IRA, is that energy efficiency home credit, because if we have across the country, I think we have something like 140 million households. If every household every year took advantage of that tax credit, we would see about $500 billion invested nationally in energy efficiency across the country. So it's a super important tax credit to realize. Ron and team were really digging into the low to moderate income segment of the market, and specifically beginning to think about delivered fuels. How do we displace heating oil, propane, as well as electric resistant heating? And then again, we tried to include some installed cost data at the bottom, some annual consumption data, because what we're trying to begin to think about is how the savings from one could pay for the other when they're paired in this, in this context. And then lastly, and then we'll come back. I'll stop after the battery storage incentives before we go ahead with questions. But so this is where, Melissa, we were talking about some of the battery storage incentives. So this is a program co-administered by the Green Bank and the EDCs. There's an upfront incentive of $250, $450, or $600 per kilowatt hour for different income classes. So if you're non-LMI, you're going to get $250 per kilowatt hour. If you are low income, you're going to get $600 per kilowatt hour, which is pretty significant. These systems are on average about 18 kilowatt hours, and you can see they have an average installed cost of $1,600 per kilowatt hour at the bottom. So for the low income families, we're taking $600 off the top there. But then the federal investment tax credits also take off more. And then there are performance incentives that the utilities administer through the active dispatch of those batteries. So you can get $225 per kW for summer and winter peak for years 1 through 5, and then $130 for years 6 through 10. If customers allow the utilities to dispatch those batteries, at an 80% level, the present value of those incentives will cover pretty much the incremental value that's left after the upfront incentive, the federal tax credit, whatever's left. So this is what we're trying to message to homeowners is there's a super incentive, take advantage of it. It's just the market is really not mature yet. So we're at the, probably like where solar was in 2008 is where battery storage is today. So lots of investment tax credits. We talked about those, and same thing on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So thinking about how all those technologies could pair, let me stop there and see if my colleagues have any other thoughts on these before we get to some, questions for consideration and next steps.
I thought you did a nice job covering it all, Brian. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. You got me trained up on the heat pumps a bit. All right, so let's go. So then we were like, okay, so how should we be thinking about this question of working together to figure out, all the different sources of incentives, from state incentives to federal incentives to financing the gap in making these technologies more affordable and accessible when you bundle them. So these are just some questions that we literally just threw up and just wanted to put out there. What's the overall market potential that we're talking about? How do we capture electrification? Higher energy. How are we dealing with higher energy burden since it's going to lift electricity, but we know it'll save on the baseboard heating or delivered fuels items. So yeah, we talked about delivered fuels. What public policy objectives are we trying to advance? We talked about the green monster there with Brian, the 310,000 heat pumps. Should we be thinking about other technologies too, EV and EV infrastructure within this portfolio? Ground source heat pumps. Heather gave us great data. I think, Steve, we could probably get to something there, another slide laying out ground source heat pumps based on some of the dandelion stuff, but we can reach out to Heather and finalize that too. How do we think about prioritizing, what is our target market, single family, multifamily? Are we thinking about income? Are we thinking about targeting delivered fuels, electric resistant heating, grid edge, those parts of the grid that have experienced the most frequent and the longest grid outages? Are we thinking about new construction versus retrofit? So a lot of just questions to think about. Some of the timing on the federal formula and competitive grant opportunities that Hank and I have talked about. And then any possible supply chain issues, inflation impacts, labor shortages, right? So lots of different questions for us to be thinking about as we're looking at the opportunities presented here. Yeah, why don't I stop there and see if there are questions that we can flag, can continue to add to this list or get some thoughts from the joint committee here before we go to next steps.
I think my questions are next steps, but John, number one.
Yeah, Brian, it would seem to me that Connecticut hasn't done very much with shared solar or community solar. And why is that? And it seems like other states are having success with that, and it would seem like a great way of providing solar for low-income communities.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. You know, the just to provide some more context on the policy, up to 5 megawatt grid tied systems can be developed. So it's a competitive RFP. What is it, Mackie? Up to 50 megawatts a year, I think the utilities can procure. So there's a bilateral arrangement between the utilities and a developer on those, you know, less than 5 megawatt utility sided projects. And then the production from those systems, 2.5 cent credits go to low income families and a number of others. So the opportunity to reduce energy burdens about, you know, $200 to probably $225 a year in those credits that low income families will get. I don't know. We're not as a green bank. We haven't focused on SCEF for solar. There's a market there to finance solar projects. We've been focusing on fuel cells, which need assistance. Fuel cells can participate in SCEF, but I'm not. I don't know. I'm not. Ron, Steve, any or others? Any other thoughts on SCEF?
I'd
No.
really have to check with the folks in our soul team. I have to confess that that's an area that I don't delve into too often. So
Yeah. Mackie sometimes calls the new affordable housing solar on-site community solar. Mac, I don't know if you want to talk about that, but it's a unique opportunity policy-wise.
I think Connecticut's what we call our community solar program, the Shared Clean Energy Facilities Program, is unique from other community solar programs in that the system is kind of, and the process for developing those is pretty disassociated from the participation, sort of customer participation in the program. You know, typically, I think in other states, you build the project and you manage subscribers who sign up for that project. Here, there's an RFP conducted for the projects, and then separately the utilities manage assigning those credits to customers based on their statutory language around what the makeup of those customers has to be. There's a lot of, we could spend the rest of the time talking about the pros and cons of that approach. But we are, as Brian said, we're getting, those are incredibly competitive auctions. You're securing 5 large projects at a pretty low price, and we're getting 50 megawatts a year.
Any other questions about shared solar? Richard has a question.
Oh, and maybe it'll be covered here, but I actually probably it's the first one. So, a question that I always have is how would this be implemented? How would we work together? Yeah, and there you go. It's number 1 on here. So, so I think Stacy had something to this effect when she was sort of highlighting the ideas of some of the themes we had for the next 3-year plan, and it seems like there's this won't happen overnight, but there's a process probably, and working through what this looks like, how would it be delivered, how would it be incorporated within the existing structure of the programs and the different programs we have.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Go ahead.
I can also say, Richard, you've been on the WAP and the SIE braiding meetings that we've been having, where we've been investigating different scenarios and cost sharing and what goes where and how it's deployed. I kind of see this as something similar. Do you
I was
agree?
thinking the same thing.
And wait, Kathy has one comment before, I know Brian, you wanted to speak up too. Kathy?
Hi, and I've been attending some of the RRES meetings, and various other cash-related things over the years. And I guess my concern is for heat pump deployment really needs to be connected to solar to make it affordable for people that are really trying to save money by deploying heat pumps. So that basically excludes renters and other people who have shaded roofs or are in condos where they don't control their roof or they don't have sun on their roofs. So I get it that, you know, SCESH and RRES are in their early stages and they're not able to serve that many people yet. But Mackie was right, we could debate all day the approaches that we're taking, but I'm just really concerned that we, you know, in order to achieve some of our goals, we need to really think a little more clearly about our solar, how we're running this solar programs and how accessible they are to everyone, even if some people have to pay for them, just like they would have to pay to install their own system on their own roof. So it's a very general statement, but I think we have a lot of work to do in this area. And I know that a lot of really specific work has been being done, especially in RRES, about really parsing out exactly how some of these minor details work. But we need to be like also looking at the bigger picture and making sure that these things are moving where we need to, even if that means legislative. If there need to be legislative changes, we need to be really clear what those need to be so we can make recommendations going forward.
Mackie, just to bring you in a little bit here, anything you want to say on like the interagency efforts and, you know, master metered sharing of the benefits to the beyond solar sorts of on-site improvements to get to speak about?
Sure. So the affordable multifamily participation in RRES that Brian spoke about earlier requires a sharing of the benefits from the project with tenants. On the tenant metered side, that's fairly straightforward, at least for everyone except for the utilities who have to do the actual work. So there's on-bill credits for, you know, you build one solar system. So that's where the sort of on-site community solar comes in. It's one solar system on the property, and at least 20% of the benefits are parceled out by the utilities to the tenant's electric bills. In the case of a master metered building where there is no individual tenant accounts, getting them their money is a lot tougher. You can't, for reasons of interfering with other housing subsidies, you can't just write them a check. Plus that's administratively complex. So what PURA has ruled is those properties, the tenant portion will be realized through an improvement to the building that's made that reflects the value of that anticipated tenant revenue stream, that 20% production over 20 years. That value has to be used to fund an upfront improvement to the property. All except one of those eligible improvements are energy efficiency improvements. The one non-energy efficiency that PURA approved was free broadband access. So they charge a interagency group, of which Green Bank is a part of, to come up with sort of the programmatic details around how to implement that. You know, how do you make sure the work's happening, and to build out any sort of additional requirements around the energy efficiency improvements.
Great, thank you, Mac. So Kathy, this is more to the multifamily affordable housing space that this is specifically for, probably the hardest problem to solve, as opposed to single family renters or condos. We're focusing in on affordable housing, multifamily here, where the policy is supporting it.
Correct. But I guess what I'm saying is beyond what RES is doing, there's so much more work to be done about community solar and how do we define community solar and community shared solar and how do we access it and how do we make that available to residents who can't do solar on their own homes, and how does that connect with our heat pump goals?
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm not at all, I think that what Mackie and the RES folks are doing is really, you know, a great step in that direction. It's just a small sliver of the work that needs to be done.
So just in terms of building on Richard's, so I think the first thing is, you know, we should get deep, Hank, you and the team in like have a similar, I don't know what the agenda is, but a similar like planning structure just to look at all these things and figure out, you know, begin to think about how within our respective plans, because the timing's pretty good, right? The FY25 through FY27 CL&M plan is up. You know, our next year plan is up. So why not try to figure out an area, a place where we can make some connection and begin to try to drive that home. So I think that's what 1 and 2 are getting at. In terms of 3 next steps, you know, so presenting today, just kind of where we are. I think, Richard, you had noted the residential committee of the EEB, and then, you know, when the time is appropriate, EEB and the board of the Green Bank, you know, respective presentations, probably when we have something that's in our plan or that we want to noodle on in the plan. That's what number 3 is getting at. And then various other to-dos are just kind of like tasks, like things that we need, data things that we need to look at, decisions we need to, it would be good to get some guidance in terms of how to think about priority focus, because the residential market is super big, 1.4 million households. Like I think our group is looking at the affordable housing side of it, the multifamily, like we're trying to be very targeted to those who need it. But you know, some of those questions on income, location are still out there. I'll stop there.
So, should we establish a subcommittee, or how do we move forward with this particular planning effort?
Maybe Hank, if you're willing to. I'm thinking of like, you know, deep coordinating this group a little bit under, you know, I don't know. That's my.
Brian, this is Ron. I mean, one of the things we did, and I didn't think about it until just now, but we didn't talk about, is that there's also a comprehensive energy strategy that's coming out, and how does that overlay onto this?
Yeah.
Yeah, and Brian, I think I sent a email related to some of this without knowing it was on the we were going to discuss it so in depth today on this agenda, but yeah, I think that makes sense. So happy to reach out and coordinate some of that, and also, yeah, based on the incoming CES, might layer on and answer some of these questions.
However, I would suggest not waiting for that, given the track record to date. If we've got some momentum, let's keep it going.
Yeah, we'll keep going.
But in Richard, just to address your point, I mean, I do, you know, I think, you know, each area has some homework to do beforehand, and I think, you know, is from the CNLM perspective, you know, we have limited resources, as we're acutely aware of. And so how do we, you know, I think we should be discussing, how do we want to prioritize that? What are the priority objectives? And any input that we can get from DEEP, I think, would be extremely valuable. And so that way, the plan that we put together goes over the next 3 years, addresses those priorities, and make sure it addresses what ultimately comes out as probably the comprehensive energy strategy.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, Ron. I mean, but let's include deep in this and make sure we're coordinated and whatnot. My point was just let's not wait for them to lead this effort. So, but certainly we need to work together on it.
The other thing I'd point out, and I think, John, you have your hand raised too, is that all the programs we're talking about here are either administered or co-administered by the EDCs. So we might have two sides of the house, you know, on the RRES one side versus the CLNM on the other side. So we just have to figure out how to connect them a bit and make them mutually reinforcing. And then I think, you know, that'll probably be an area we'll want to dive into.
That, my raised hand was just left over from the last question.
Ah, gotcha. Thanks, John.
Kathy.
I think this is just also a general note, is when we talk about affordable housing and low income customers, and whenever we're going in that direction in our thoughts and planning, we need to really make sure that what we're doing is actually going to make a meaningful impact for the resident. So like if it's a really small impact spread over lots of residents, it might look really good in terms of achieving our goals, but it may not mean really anything to the individual resident. And so I just want that we always keep that in mind as we move forward in our planning processes.
Yeah, you're hitting a big button, huh, Mac? Just to kind of reinforce some of that point, Kathy, like we may be dealing with highly dense affordable housing that's vertical, where we can't get much solar around to deliver more savings benefits to all the tenants. So we may be achieving policy objectives, but we're not delivering a lot of energy burden reduction benefits to the tenants. But we have that optimization in our minds as well. Yeah, super important.
Well, and Brian, maybe I'm wrong here, but and Kathy, you're whenever we talk about priorities and stuff like this, a picture of your face always pops up in my mind, because the question is, this gets into, you know, are we looking at trying to do, you know, essentially the saying was, do we go deeper with one customer versus broader in that? I mean, because to your point, we can address more customers by not doing as much at each customer. But is that really the path that we want to go to? Because that they both check the boxes, but which one do we want to do?
Great question. Let's frame that in like as a, yeah.
Yeah. So I see this as an effort that will span multiple months and looking at different scenarios and different combinations of incentives and coordination. So I look forward to seeing Deep start organizing these meetings. So everybody needs to drop off. I want to give the opportunity for public comment if anybody wants to make public comment before making sure that we address the rest of the agenda in some way. Okay, I don't see any public comment. So what do we want to do with the rest of the agenda? Do we want to
I think
take
Ron,
another few minutes?
yeah, just some quick.
I'm gonna try to beat Stacy at her own game. I'm not even gonna talk to these slides. I think they're pretty much self-explanatory. And if there's questions, please reach out to me directly on it. But the idea was to summarize changes that happened for 2024, because as we're going through all this planning process, to keep this in mind, not only what are we doing in the future, but what are we dealing with today?
Okay, so these are a resource. These slides are in the Dropbox for people to look at if they want to know how the plans have changed to accommodate our next year budget. Right.
Yep.
Great
job, Ron.
Perfect. All right. Are we done? Does anyone have any final comments, or do you want to move to adjourn?
Sure, sounds good.
Say, I said I move to adjourn. Is
Thanks
there a
all.
second? Okay. All in favor? Okay, we're adjourned.
Hey,
Okay. Okay.
Thanks.
bye.
Take care, everyone.